This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halpern. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about their books and research and other things that we like. And if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we cannot thank you enough. This episode is part of a series in partnership with the Israel office of the Konrad Adenauer Foundation that we like to call Israel Behind the Headlines, delving deep into and unpacking issues underlying our lives here in Israel. My guest today is a veteran public campaigner and politician, formerly Deputy Mayor of Jerusalem and a member of Knesset for Kulanu, a now defunct right-of-center party led by then Finance Minister Moshe Kahlon. She's also currently chairwoman of Life and Environment, that's an umbrella organization for environmental movements in Israel, as well as CEO of Darkenu, the largest civil society organization in the country, working to introduce democratic, liberal and moderate ideas into the larger Israeli discourse. After leaving the Knesset, she wrote a book entitled Guided Revolution, whose tagline is a step-by-step manual towards social change in Israel. It was published in 2020 in Hebrew by Kinneret Zmora Bitan. And I'm delighted to say hello and welcome to Rachel Azaria.
Hi, nice being here.
So the book, as the tagline suggests, is a sort of do's and don'ts manual for an aspiring social activist. As you write in the introduction, this is the book you wish you could read when you kicked off your long and impressive campaigning career. So, what are the main things, the most pressing and fundamental things that you know now that you didn't 20-odd years ago when you started?
Oh, wow. So the first classic idea that I think it's true for many countries is that you always have to work with three pillars. One is working with the people. Okay, you need a lot of people to support you. The noble idea of democracy at the end is translated to the the noble idea of democracy, as it at the end is translated to the less noble idea of politics, which means that politicians check how many people you have with you, and you need to have a lot of people with you. So that's like the people part. Then there is the press. You need the press there, first of all, so people will know to join you, and also so the politicians hear about what you're doing. And the third is to approach politicians and talk to them. Now, I know that many places around the world, it's very clear that you approach politicians and talk to them. In Israel, for some reason, that is the part that's the hardest for social change entrepreneurs to understand. You actually have to say what exactly you want. You can't just say, you are corrupt. They don't know what you're saying. You have to say, we want A, B, C, D. So that was one thing to explain to a lot of Israelis.
So to come with a sort of thought out and planned out policy program.
And to bring with you people and to bring the press and to go to the specific politician that can actually make a difference. I think that's something that's interesting for people that are not Israelis, and it's something that's very important specifically for Israel, is that the only way that you can really win in a social campaign change is when you establish surprising coalitions. Like in Israel, the way politics works is that it's very clear who is standing where. And the politicians are used to hearing one very clear voice that comes from one area in Israeli society. Once you manage to establish a surprising coalition, they just don't know what to do. And usually that's the moment you win. And I think that if there's one lesson that I think also gives like the behind scenes of Israeli politics is this kind of establishing these surprising coalitions.
Yeah, so overwhelm politicians with unlikely coalitions. Can you give an example of an unlikely coalition that you were part of?
In nearly any campaign I describe in the book.
Oh, they're all unlikely coalitions.
I think almost everything. So like, I'll give an example when we're working against segregation and disappearance of women from public sphere. Okay? It started when they wouldn't put my poster on the bus when I was running for city council in Jerusalem 15 years ago. I had to go to the Supreme Court. Long story. I went back and forth to the Supreme Court 4 times. And at first, we thought that we were against the ultra-Orthodox because they were the people that we understood that are against the posters of women on buses. What we understood as time went by is that a lot of women in the ultra-Orthodox community hate sitting in the back of the bus, hate the separate streets, hate the separation in, when you go to libraries, when you go to health clinics or whatever. And at the end, once we managed to mobilize them and to turn them to part of the campaign, that's it. That was a game changer. Also, when we managed to establish a coalition of women, also Orthodox, also liberal, secular. At first, the secular women said, what do we care? And the feminist Orthodox, I'm a feminist Orthodox, we were like the leaders of the campaign. Once the secular women joined and the ultra-Orthodox women, that's it, we won. I'll give you another example. We were working for fair wage for the teachers and the after-school activities. Okay, long story. The government wanted to cut their wages between 30 to 50%. When they started, I remember I looked at them and I was like, how are we ever going to win in this kind of campaign? They are very weak women. They're not, politically, they're not a real power. And we realized that we have to establish the same kind of surprising coalition. So we mobilized parents to be part of it. But at the beginning, the parents that were part of it were only the strong parents, okay? And then we had to persuade also the rest of the regular middle-class parents why it's important to them also. And then they got on board. And then we also established a coalition with the morning kindergarten teachers. And we managed to establish this kind of coalition. And from a very small, politically weak group, we managed to establish a coalition that, that's it. The mayor had to find a solution.
How do you do it? How do you tap into this sense of solidarity that seems to be so lacking in Israel at the moment?
So I think the way is never to preach, not to tell them, you need to do it if you're not doing it, so you're not okay. And often that's what groups do, okay? When you're very persuaded that something is right, so if someone else doesn't understand, you get very upset, okay? You can't get upset. Other people think differently because they actually think differently, and that's okay. What you need to do is figure out where their values are or what's in it for them. And those are the two options. You either bring them in through their values, or you bring it through through the fact that they understand that they have something to gain to be part of this coalition. Not necessarily because they think like you. Maybe you think differently, but there's something that you can work on. It doesn't mean you're the same person. It just means that on this we're working together. So, with the kindergartens, what we did is we explained to middle class parents that if the wage would be very low, they don't have to do it because they're ideologically there, okay? But actually they won't have after school activities, because if every 2 weeks you have a new teacher, the children won't be willing to go, or there'll be once a week a day that they won't have enough teachers, so they won't have the activities. So we managed to persuade people to understand that they have to be part of this campaign. And then they joined in. Something else also, I'll give you another example for this kind of solidarity, is we were in this campaign that women will have the right to go to the mikveh. Mikveh is a ritual bath, and to practice the religion and the ritual bath the way they want to, and not the way rabbis, the rabbinical Israeli establishment forces them to do it. And when we were in this campaign, at a certain point, it was there were legislators that tried to change it. I was a member of the Knesset, and I was trying to, bring other legislators with me against this legislation. And at first, this is solidarity, but it's even more sophisticated. At first, I was telling them it's against women's rights. Okay, you can't tell a woman, it's our right on our body, you can't tell women how to use the ritual bath. It's against women's rights. When I use the word rights, it's something that's very left-wing, center-left. Okay, it's very liberal. I need to talk to a more conservative group. And I was trying to find the wording. Now, my father's from Tunis, my mother's from America, from the United States. So I have like half of my brain is like liberal thinking, half of my brain is more conservative. I was trying to think, how would my cousins say it? Because I knew that my cousins, the women amongst my cousins, they were for this campaign. And I tried to think how they would say it. And I realized instead of saying it's their right, I said it's not dignifying women to tell them how to use the ritual bath. You need to respect, you need to give the place to the way their mothers did it and their grandmothers did it. Like, you can't come and tell a woman how to do it. It's against their dignity or their honor. And once I used those words, suddenly I could mobilize members of the Knesset that are more conservative to this kind of idea. So it's really understanding that different people think of ideas differently and they come from a different perspective. But if you need them to come together on something very specific. It doesn't mean that they agree with everything. It doesn't mean that they'll be, specifically like, part of your camp and everything. You need to establish these kind of coalitions and these kind of solidarities.
So do you think really that the problem with many civil society campaigns is that the whole civil society discourse is too much rooted in a left-wing discourse, as you say, of rights, etc., and also run by people who are, self-proclaimed left-wing supporters?
I don't know if that's the problem. I think that we will be much more successful once we understand, like, this is Jonathan Haidt, the professor from NYU, that talks about the different ways of understanding moral ideas, moral values. I think that the more that we understand that the Israeli society is a very diverse society, and you can't expect people to be exactly like you. So I think that the faster we understand that and the better we understand that, chances are that we'll really manage to bring many more of our ideas and our values to everyone. And I want to say, at the end of the day, Israeli society, even though we see the elections, what happened in the elections in Israel, that it's a very right-wing, ultra-Orthodox coalition, at least that's what it seems will be formed. It hasn't been formed, we don't know, whatever. At the same time, Israeli society is a very liberal society. Now, it doesn't make sense for a second, okay? But when you see the way LGBTQ in Israel are treated in a very liberal way. Now, it shows that Israelis are liberal, but they're also very traditional. Now, how do you understand it? Okay. One of the ways, or the biggest door that was open to LGBTQ rights in Israel was once they started talking about families, okay? And then everyone can imagine the mother of anyone from the community, they want grandchildren. And it's like, give her a grandchild. Why aren't you giving? And then when that became the discourse, so it's like, of course, and what difference does it make? And so it's interesting because it's a liberal idea with a lot of tradition in it. Yeah. So it's just a different perspective.
Right. So this is the way to do activism in Israel. And I want to ask you, you recite many successful campaigns and you allude to some unsuccessful campaigns. And I want to ask you, to do a post-mortem of the unsuccessful ones. You said, what makes a good campaign, the 3 pillars. I'm sure that towards the end of, once you've matured as an activist, you follow this roadmap religiously. What does make, at the end of the day, looking back on the unsuccessful ones, what makes a campaign fail?
More than anything, I think the campaign is unsuccessful when the crowd isn't ripe for it yet. When you are trying to step too many steps ahead of the crowd. Often you first need to persuade people with something so much deeper and so much more fundamental, like the campaign against Route 6. Okay, people didn't understand why another highway isn't good for them. They were like, but a highway is great. Why is a highway bad for you? And so you first need to go through this fundamental idea, and only then you can move ahead. And also, like the campaign for the agunot, women that can't get their Jewish divorce. And in Israel, marriage and divorce is all through the rabbinical court. So I think that people didn't understand, they didn't know enough, they didn't understand enough. And when you try to skip the stage of persuading the people, that's when you fail. You have to mobilize people towards your ideas. That's what I was talking about, the noble idea of democracy. And when you translate it to politics, at the end, the idea is that the people decide. And if you can't go through that stage, it's go, no go, even if you are right. I think that's very important. You can be 100% right, but if you can't persuade the crowd, it won't work.
So even the most noble causes can fail just because they couldn't garner enough support. So actually, this leads me to my next question. Is there really a ripe and sufficiently ripe civil society culture in Israel? It seems like there isn't, that, the Israelis' notion of democracy is sometimes pretty limited.
In a sense, yes, that's why I wrote the book. When I left the Knesset, I was during the 20th Knesset. It was a 4-year term. The last 4-year term, for the past few years.
It's between 2015 and 2019.
Right. Mm-hmm. And towards the end of the term, I started feeling that something's going crazy. And I told people, listen, this is not the regular Israeli politics. Something is going crazy. I could feel it. I could sense it. And people are like, no, that's how it's always been that way. I was like, no, listen, something is wrong here. And when I left the Knesset, I had the sense that we're heading for a fall. Now, in my wildest dreams, I didn't imagine 5 elections, one after the other, but I knew something is wrong. And what I felt more than anything is that in Israel, we don't understand the value of democracy. We don't understand how much power it gives us. And if we think that democracy is only to go and vote once every year, 3 months, 2 years, 1 year, whatever, also in dictatorships, you often vote. That's not the real idea. The idea is that you can really make a change. You can really make a difference. And that's why I sat down and wrote the book, to give people the tools to make this kind of difference. I will say at the same time that it's interesting because on the one hand, we don't know how to make a difference. On the other hand, we are a society that we love protesting. Like every few months, there's this huge protest, whatever. The problem is that we don't know how to take all that energy and turn it into something that actually makes a difference. You can have this huge protest and nothing happens. And then people feel that there's no point in protesting because nothing happens. No, there is a point, but you have to know, you mobilize the people, you have to use the press, and you have to know who's the politician that can actually make a difference and make sure that all that energy is towards the change you want with the specific politician you want. But that's like strategic work that people don't know how to do. I just want to say a sentence. There is like this children's song in Israel that goes, we're demonstrating, never mind what about, kind of whatever. It's like everyone sings it and I hate it. It's like from day one we were taught that a demonstration is just to demonstrate because it doesn't really matter what for, but it does matter.
It seems like what you have on your mind is the biggest social protest in the history of Israel, the cost of living protest in 2011. And thinking about it through your prism, they ticked all the boxes, right? They had 1 million people behind them, if not more. They had all the media on their side. They had plenty of politicians. One of the leaders ran for Knesset. Your own party actually thrived on this idea of reducing the cost of living, and Kachlon himself. That was the whole raison d'être of the party. Why did it fail then?
Because they didn't know how to say A, B, C, D. We want 5 changes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They didn't know how to say it. By the way, I was part of the protest for young families at that time, and we knew how to say exactly what we want, and we were the only protest that was successful. We said we want after-school activities for free or subsidized. We want early childhood. We knew exactly what we wanted, and we got almost everything on the years that since then. So you need to know exactly what you want. That's part of the idea. You need to know, and you need to go and tell the politician exactly what you want. Not only this is not okay. I just want to say something. There have been a few successful social, protests. There have been a few successful protests, like the protest after the Yom Kippur War, that the prime minister stepped down, Golda Meir. But that, I think that's the kind of protest that we know how to do better. We're against something, and then she leaves, okay? But we don't know very well how to say 1, 2, 3, 4. This is what we want. So.
Yeah, actually, you gave me an idea for the headline for this item. We know what we are against. We don't know what we're for. That's a very Israeli thing, actually. Is there in Israel any area of activism, because you've been all over the place, right?
Yeah.
In environmental activism, cost of living activism, religious versus secular civil liberties, women's rights, what have you. Is there any area that is more ripe for social activism in Israel, that it's easier to, mobilize support, to talk to politicians, all the things that you need to do?
So I think that every few years it changes. Okay, like the end of the 90s, beginning of 2000, environmental campaigns were extremely successful. We passed so many legislations. It just happened to be that, we managed to find that moment that also the organizations were very well organized, knew how to work together. And also we had some politicians that were with us and we could really be very successful. There were years at State and Religion. Like every few years, like there's a moment that suddenly everything becomes ripe and you can be very successful. So I think that there is this vibe, but it's also always hard to tell, like when will this moment kind of happen that will really manage to be successful.
So it is a dynamic business after all. Going back to what we said earlier about Israeli society and how it works and our notion of democracy, it is evolving at the end of the day.
Yeah, it is evolving. I think that at the same time, there are also powers that what we see now in our Israeli politics. There are powers that are working the other way, against. There's a lot of backlash. We see it a lot in women's rights, LGBTQ, by the way, they have been extremely successful for the past few years. I mean, really groundbreaking. So there are those moments that suddenly everything can change. So we see the backlash now in Israeli politics. But we also see, and I think this is going to be a very interesting moment, suddenly how the social change organizations are going to work together. There is a very big threat to social change in Israel. I talked about the 3 pillars. There is one amazing power that we have or tool that we can use, and that's the Supreme Court. I talked about going back and forth to the Supreme Court about segregation, disappearance of women from public sphere. There is now this major legislation that the government intends on passing that is going to weaken the Supreme Court very, very much. And for social change organizations, this is a huge threat. Like this is one of our biggest tools or weapons. You don't always use it in social change because if you lose, so the campaign is over. But if you win, like that's the trophy. Mm-hmm. Okay? So you have to use it very carefully. But now the government wants to weaken the Supreme Court, and this is a real threat on social change organizations. And now we're working together to make sure that legislation won't pass. But that's going to be...
So the unlikely coalitions that you talked about are more necessary than ever.
More necessary than ever, yeah. And it can't be only like women's rights, it can't be only liberal we can't have only the liberal crowd here. We have to have many other crowds together in this kind of campaign.
Do you think that, less liberal sectors within Israeli society will feel that backlash? That, I don't know, conservative women or, people like ultra-Orthodox people and, all sorts of minorities, even those who voted for the current government, are going to feel, hang on a second, this is too much even for us?
So I think that we need to hold a very strong campaign. Thank God the Supreme Court had some very important verdicts that have changed many, many people's lives. I think people in Israel aren't always aware of it, so we need to create awareness. There was a very important verdict regarding accessibility to schools.
For disabled people.
For disabled people, yeah, and that forced all the schools to be accessible. That's something that has to do with every parent in
Israel. And people don't know it's down to the Supreme Court. So in the words of Joni Mitchell, you don't know what you got till it's gone.
Or people can understand. And also everything that has to do with children with disabilities, that they'll be able to go to regular schools and they won't be forced to go to special ed schools. That's also a verdict of the Supreme Court that totally changed the Israeli school system. And that's something that parents, because we are liberal and traditional at the same time, parents worry about their children. That is something that can really persuade people to be part of this kind of movement against this legislation.
Are you very pessimistic about this the impending government? We're recording on a day that it hasn't been officially sworn in yet.
It is going to be challenging. As we said, I'm former deputy mayor of Jerusalem. I saw what happened in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is usually between 10 and 20 years before the rest of Israel.
Or behind, depends on your perspective.
No, what happens in Jerusalem usually happens before it happens in the rest of Israel, and that isn't very optimistic.
Yes,
okay,
right.
And I love Jerusalem, and I live in Jerusalem, and but I think that's. It kind of gave us the training to understand what's happening and to, see the reality in clear and vivid colors. So these are going to be very challenging times. On the other hand, this is an opportunity that I think people can actually figure out what their values are. Part of the challenge in liberal communities is that it's very hard to actually talk about values because, it's like our value is that everyone can be, kind of postmodern. Everyone can believe in whatever they believe. And this is a moment that can help people clarify their values and understand what they're willing to fight for. And it's harder for liberal people to get organized and fight for something. It's easier usually for more religious or traditional people because the values are much more clear. So in that sense,
but also I would say because the liberals are probably more well off, and the traditional people are normally underprivileged, this sense of political activism is perhaps less instilled. So it's really about, politicizing the masses, in inverted commas. It's also a question of socioeconomic.
Yeah. In what sense? I agree.
That the liberals are more well off, and therefore, part of that is having more, the mental bandwidth and more time to spend on political activism.
Yeah.
And the traditional people are normally more underprivileged and therefore have less of that mental bandwidth to be politically active. So it's really also overcoming that hurdle. And you think that, there's a chance for that?
In Israel, it's different because since a lot of the underprivileged, not everyone, a lot of the underprivileged people in Israel are ultra-Orthodox, and the government pays for the men to study, and no one checks if they study all the time, so they have time to do political work that usually...
And they do?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And usually, people that work in high-tech, they don't really have time to do the political work. So in Israel is different than many other countries in that sense. And the ultra-Orthodox are very organized politically, and they have time.
Mm-hmm.
They have a lot of youngsters. It's very different.
Yeah, it seems to me we talked about your social activism and we talked about your political career in the Knesset. normally I would say that for a social activist, for a campaigner, getting elected, becoming a public representative is possibly the culmination of their calling. And it seems, I'm reading between the lines, correct me if I'm wrong, that it feels like, before you were elected to the Knesset, you were able to do more than you could do as an ordinary member of the Knesset. Am I wrong here?
It's more sophisticated. On the one hand, being in the Knesset gave me opportunities to pass legislations. I passed legislations that no one thought I could pass. Like, I was first term, young politician, but because of my background in social change, and because that I mobilized people, like the crowd, to support me in these kind of legislations. So, another week for maternity leave, healthy food in all the daycare centers, like a lot of the, big, expensive legislations. I could pass a lot of big and expensive legislations. That's one thing. And I could also stop some really, really challenging legislations that the government wants to pass now. In the 20th Knesset, they weren't able to pass it because I gave them a hard time. I didn't let it happen. I didn't let it work, whatever. I will say that when you're in politics, you have to be much more sophisticated in the way you work. And also, it's often hard to explain to the crowd what you're doing because they see only what you can allow them to see, because a lot of the work is behind scenes. So it's this complicated situation that I feel that that's part of the maturity that we need in Israeli society, to have a little more faith in their politicians, like especially in the liberal side. The conservative parts of Israeli society have more faith in their leaders. Liberals have usually less faith, at least in Israel, have less faith in the leaders. And like in the first moment, they're like, oh, you're a traitor. No, I'm not a traitor. In order to pass this, I have to do a sophisticated game. Trust me that at the end I'll be able to do it, but don't yell at me while I'm playing the sophisticated game with the coalition to make it happen.
So the fact that you joined a right of center party that eventually also joined Netanyahu's coalition together with all the ultra-Orthodox and other right-wing parties, that were avowedly anti-liberal in many ways, and personally opposed to your legislation proposals. Yeah. So I'm guessing you joined the Right of Center Party because it more or less reflects your own views. But was there also a pragmatic aspect to it, like saying, okay, maybe it's going back to my question about the left-wing discourse here, is rights activism too important to be left to left-wing rights activists, and we should cast the net a bit wider? So
I'm very centrist for many years, since Rabin was assassinated. I come from a very right-wing family. I'm married into a left-wing family. Whatever, it is what it is. You married out. But it is what it is. And I joined the party I joined. It was a party that was debating what kind of party it is. Is it more of a centrist party? Centrist, like Mizrahi, which is like Sephardic working class, which is something that I really feel for. A lot of my family, that's half of my family, like my father's side. And I also believe that politics should be very much like talking to the real people. And it was a party that was debating if it's actually a right-wing party and it's going to join the Likud, or it's more of a centrist party. Unfortunately, after a term, Kachlon decided it's more of a right-wing party, and that's when I also left. So your wing of the party lost in a way. Exactly. Mm-hmm. That's what happened. But I will say that being in the coalition, it was very hard. But I'm also very happy I was there, because I could do work that I couldn't do from the opposition. So like being a swing vote, I was kind of a swing vote. Being a swing vote is very challenging. I think also often you get bashed from both sides, but it is a very effective position. So I knew I was effective. You have a lot of leverage. But it is very hard. Like I kept getting bashed from both sides all the time, and you just need to understand that's how the way it is and keep running, but it's hard. Do you ever miss the Knesset, or was one term enough? I don't miss Israeli politics at this point because they're very. I mean, it's really. It's tough. It's not like normal politics, but I enjoyed politics, and I'm 44 years old, so I assume in the future.
Well, that's more or less the age Netanyahu just started his political career, and look where he is now, almost 30 years old.
I make fun. I make a joke that I'm a 44-year-old woman with formers of an 84-year-old woman. So
exactly.
like I have another career ahead of me.
Okay, well, good luck with that.
Thank you.
Rachel Azaria.
Was that serious or I'm joking?
Well, I'll leave it to the listeners to judge. Rachel Azaria, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And also many thanks to Itai Shellam, the manager of TLV1 Studios. And now we've got a request because many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app and would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. Good, bad, ugly, up to you. You too can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has something like 800 interviews to keep you entertained and hopefully annoyed. Like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and most important, join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from me here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.